You are listening to the SabreCoachKate podcast, where I highlight the great thinkers, athletes, and coaches in the dynamic sport of Olympic fencing.
Guard. Boy, howdy.
Thank you for joining me today for episode 2 of the SabreCoachKate podcast. Today you'll hear a conversation I had with Roberto Sobalvarro. He is full of surprises. He came to fencing in an unusual way, playing tennis during his young life, then taking up fencing on a dare. After graduating from college, he decided to take a job as a high school fencing coach instead of the law school path he had originally planned for himself. Perhaps the biggest surprise of all was his climb to the pinnacle of coaching in our sport. He was the women's Epee coach at the 2012 Olympics and helped them take home the only medal the U.S. would receive in fencing at those games. He is now the head coach at Twin Cities Fencing Club in St. Paul, Minnesota, and has been involved in fencing for over 35 years. In recognition for all his accomplishments, Ro will be inaugurated into the Hall of Fame this year. Tune in now for the interview I conducted with Ro. This was my first long-distance interview, and I was secretly terrified the whole time it wasn't recording. Any awkwardness is totally on me, as Ro was extremely kind and very enthusiastic about doing this interview. All right, I am talking today to Ro Sobalvarro. This is the SabreCoachKate podcast, and I am so excited to be talking with you today, Ro. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking.
Can't wait to hear what you got to tell all of us today. So let's get started with the obvious question. How did you become a fencer?
I actually was a collegiate varsity tennis player, and my doubles partner's brother fenced. And he teased us a lot after we had a particularly bad life experience with a couple of European full scholarship players who reduced us to molecules in a doubles match. I remember hitting probably the best serve of my collegiate career and having it come back twice as fast and angled in a way that I couldn't even get a good look at, let alone hit. And the coach saying, "Nice serve." And I said, "Why? Why would you say that?"
If it were nice, it wouldn't have been returned.
It wouldn't have come back like an exocet and gone right past me, and they weren't even perspiring. And he teased us, and I thought, well, maybe we should try this. And so he actually sent us 2 jackets, 2 masks, and 2 foils. And we began to fiddle around by ourselves as college students are wont to do. And I found a class for it at a related college, and so I took the class. And that was kind of the beginning and the end of my tennis career.
Well, and I read an article that said that you were beating his brother pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, he wasn't all that great.
Okay.
But neither was I. I had no idea what I was doing.
So you were entirely self-taught as far as fencing goes?
Oh heavens, no.
Okay.
I took that class, which led to another class, which led to lessons with a coach. I wound up teaching classes for him, which was certainly the Learn As You Go program. So I had to write myself a lesson plan. I'd never done that before. And then, every opportunity I got as I was going along, I would get a lesson from somebody or watch someone. You have to realize I'm elderly, and this was in the days before NACs. There were just big tournaments, and there was nationals and there was JOs, and that was pretty much it. And there were large tournaments like the Chicagoland, which no longer exists, the Cherry Blossom, which continues to exist, and you would go to those. And I would watch coaches, and I would, when possible, take lessons. I watched Joe Paczynski so often that he finally turned around and said, "Young man, would you like a lesson?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir, I would."
Please,
and
sir.
So I got some lessons from the patron saint of U.S. fencing, one of the kindest men and most talented coaches we've ever had. But he was amazingly kind, and there was no reason for him to do that. And I never forgot.
Wow.
I still have.
That's really great. Well, and you were primarily a foil fencer, right?
It was the upper Midwest in the 70s. I fenced foil, I fenced saber, which was the days of dry saber, which is not recognizably saber anymore. And the person who was supposed to win the bout almost always did, regardless of what the score should have been, because it was dry.
Yeah, funny how that worked.
Yeah, and so saber quickly held no charm for me, or not much, because it was frustrating coming from where I was to be able to score touches on fencers and not get them. So foil was the way to go, because the light came on and it was hard to argue with one light hits.
Right.
And everybody told me I was too short to fence Epee. I'm 5'9", which doesn't make me on the tall side. So I started to fence some Epee tournaments, and I always did really well. I would finish regularly. Again, this is the upper Midwest in the 70s, finishing regularly in the top 4. And it was mostly on speed and taking the blade, frankly, because they were kind of bouncing around trying to pick at your wrist, this being the 70s in the upper Midwest, and I could just take their blade and 8 and stuff them. It wasn't genius, but it was a start.
It worked.
It worked. It's decidedly not genius.
Well, as with anything in fencing, if it's working, just do it. Yeah.
And what really got me going on Epee, and this is another bad, I shouldn't tell these stories because they don't reflect well on me. I went to take my Moniteur exam, my first level coach's exam. And I drove through the night into darkest Wisconsin, where there was a collegiate coach who was giving the exam. And I passed foil with the highest marks you get, and I passed saber with the highest marks you get, and he flunked me in Epee and just said I shouldn't do it. And I went back pretty damn determined. And the next time, and the happy ending is the next time I saw that guy was several years later in England, as I was walking in with the U.S., which I was now the coach of, the U.S. team, into a World Cup, and I walked past him, turned to look at him, and said hi, and he said, "Oh, I see you worked at this." Yeah.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Oh, that's great. Well, I do want to ask you definitely more about your coaching, because I know that most of your accomplishments are in the world of coaching. But let me go back just a little bit to your fencing career. You said that there weren't many, if it can be called that, because I know that you had just said that there weren't many tournaments that you could go to. But what was your greatest fencing accomplishment? I mean, maybe not one of those tournaments, but just your career as a fencer. What was your best thing?
I always, and oddly enough, I still do, and no one considers me this anymore, but I always considered myself, especially when I was starting, an outsider. Most of the people I ran into had been fencing much longer than I had fenced before college. And I became a technically proficient fencer because I knew how to practice. Tennis is a very technical sport, and so learning another technical sport was, comparatively speaking, not difficult for me. I knew how to work on it. I knew the importance of technique, and I was willing to do something over and over and over again until I got it right. And so starting to be able to beat those guys, starting to be able to not just fence with them and get clocked and look like a mess while I was doing it, but be technically as good and tactically better. And for me, that was incredibly satisfying. And there were a number of regional events and local events that I was getting into when I was traveling to Chicago, the Chicagoland, and some of the bigger regional events. And I was doing well enough to be able to hold my head up and have people at least recognize me when I walked into the room. And maybe once in a while say, "Oh, shit," when they saw me in their pool. Because remember, for one thing, this was all pools in those days.
Oh, that's
pools,
right.
4 up to however pools of 6, 3 up to however many pools. It was all pools. So we fenced like zillions of 5-touch bouts. But for somebody who was learning to fence this way, taking lessons where he could, studying fencing by watching, asking, I'm sure, what were dumb questions from proficient coaches who were willing to talk to me, this was perfect, because I wasn't going to get one bout and out. I was going to get 5 bouts, 6 bouts in this pool, probably go up. Almost certainly go up, and so I could do it over and over and over again, and it was perfect for me. Looking back, I really enjoyed it, or I wouldn't be sitting here.
Exactly.
Because it was just such a constant challenge, and to go from being that outsider, which I still have this. It's so funny when I hear people talk about me as this insider, and I think, really? Because fencing was just an alien world to me, and I remember the first time I asked how long the bouts were, they said, 4 minutes. And I said, really? Because I'm used to be, 2 out of 3 sets. I'm out there an hour and a half, 2 hours if things are going badly. 45 minutes if things go really, really well.
Right. Well, talk to me about a time when you had to overcome difficulty as you competed, and what was the outcome of that? I mean, you said that you were an outsider. Was there ever a specific moment, though, that you remember, you were really far down and you had to fight your way back?
I remember struggling back in a like to get out of a second round pool in dry saber. And I was really having a heck of a time. And the calls were going against me. And there was a local collegiate coach who, as I went to, and I almost started to say hook up. There's no hooking up. As I went to the line to start at the bout I really had to win, leaned over and said, "I'm pulling for you, mate."
Thank you, sir.
He'd never seen me before, and he said, you put up one hell of a fight, and you got out of that pool. And that was a pretty satisfying experience, to be the new kid in town, and kind of probably, I'm so glad there are no videotapes. The videotape only barely existed. I'm so glad I don't have to look at that, but probably brawl my way out is probably what I did.
Yeah, good thing there wasn't any Facebook or, YouTube back in that day. No record of this, right?
No. Well, in dry saber, sometimes you wanted to pop that canvas jacket pretty solidly, so you could get hit pretty hard, and if you made a noise, they knew you were hit. So this, fencing in the Upper Midwest.
I have heard from other people that it was an art to not cry out in pain as you got hit,
God, yeah.
because you didn't want to acknowledge that you'd been hit. Yeah.
No, you had to suck it up, and so anybody from the sort of hairy knuckle day of men's saber will tell you the same thing. That thing wrapped around you, and they were much more flexible. Remember, we didn't know these S2000 blades, man. These were like fly rods, and they would wrap around you, and no whimpering allowed.
Well, you got a lot of advice from, it sounds like, a lot of different coaches. Mm-hmm. What's the best advice you ever got from a coach?
It's not the single best advice, because it's not. I was lucky enough to get to study with Zbigniew Tchaikovsky, and it was completely eye-opening. And it wasn't a single piece of advice. It was a way of looking at things, and a way of focusing on fencing, and a way of developing a lesson and understanding all of these facets. And that was miraculous. And for years afterwards, I would be sitting at some World Cup someplace, and he would come and sit down next to me out of the blue sky and pick up right where he left off the last time I saw him. Wow. And so I would get these little seminars that would be like an hour long between rounds, or longer if I was out. It was responsible for pretty much everything I accomplished, was just changing the way, learning to ask, why do I do it this way? Why do they teach it that way? Because if you can't answer that question, perhaps you shouldn't be doing it. And then I still say that when I'm giving coaching clinics. I still say, ask yourself why you're doing it. And if the answer is because someone told me to do it that way, or the answer is because I've always done it that way, you need to take a hard, fast look at this. Yeah. It was an impressive feat. All the knowledge he managed to hammer into my head in relatively short bursts, taking lessons from him, giving lessons to people so he could watch. He is not an easy or kind taskmaster. And I asked him once why, and he said, because I have a finite amount of time to put this information into your head, and probably this making it so hard that it's almost impossible. You will either learn or you will quit. He said, I think you'll learn. And I did, but it was not fun. Mm-hmm. And he was responsible for a lot of it, if not most of it. And just the sheer hard work that was required to get it was something I was lucky enough to have in me, that I could work that hard and be willing to make mistakes sometimes, and see them for what they were and fix them.
Do you ever regret that you started fencing as an adult?
No, it just didn't. In the area where I lived, it just didn't exist. You knew about it if you knew about the Olympic sports, but it just wasn't a possibility. Growing up a junior tennis player is not bad. It was fun. I can't play anymore because of a shoulder injury, and I still miss it. I would rather be, this is just pathetic, but I would rather be in the fencing gym. But I just stand outside of that court. I was lucky enough when I was in high school to have dinner with Jesse Owens. And I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I was selected to do this by this high school I went to. And he was a real inspiration to learn to hear. I knew about him from my grandmother, who was astonished that I was going to be having dinner with him. About diligence, about hard work, about passing on. And he gave me a lot of advice that I've always remembered. So it was those two influences, Tchaikovsky and, believe it or not, Jesse Owens, and it really stayed with me.
Do you think you could have been as successful as an adult fencer as you were without your background in tennis?
No, absolutely not. I really don't think so. It made the same sense of discipline that allowed you to hit thousands of serves or hit so many volleys off a bangboard, and get that hand position and get that hip down and get the proper rotation through the ball. You need to be able to do that to be a good fencer, or probably a good athlete of any kind. But those high technique sports, fencing, tennis, you've got to be willing to put that time in. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Right. Well, what does that say about sport specialization? Do you think it's a good idea to just focus on one sport? Or, like in your case, the skills that you learned from one really helped you excel in the other? Should, especially young people, be specializing, or should they be trying various sports to see which one they're really taken by?
That's really a hot topic right now. And I have definitely mixed feelings about it. I as a kid, I ran cross country, and I did cross country skiing because I live up where it's cold, and I enjoyed that immensely. Not so much running. I enjoyed cross country skiing a lot. And I did other things, but if you'd asked me if I played a sport, I would say tennis. I cycled a lot. I still cycle a lot. So it's kind of hard for me to answer. It's we in my club we have kids classes only twice a week, and some of those kids come in other days, but we don't tell them they have to. We make it possible for them to. And so I'm not telling kids, you have to give up anything and you have to only focus on this. But as a coach, as they're getting older and they're starting to make that jump, and you're seeing their peer group locally and nationally make that jump, and they say, well, I want to go out for football. You sigh. Yeah. Or I want to do the musical. Every coach has heard that. Yeah. And on the one hand, that's going to be a good experience for them. But on the other hand, you're thinking, oh my God. So it's really hard for me to answer. I would never tell a kid, or his parents, especially his parents, that they needed to just focus on this and not do anything else and not have anything else in their life. Because I think that's wrong. No, I certainly did other things. I did do the musical in high school, but I still played tennis. It might be more of a question is how many of these kids are so overbooked that adding one more thing is crazy. And I encounter that constantly. Well, they're really, she's really doing well in this class. Obviously, they're become the best or almost the best in it. I would like to move them to this day at this time instead, where it's going to be a little more challenging, and we'll drop this group and move into that group. So I'm not really increasing the number of gym hours, but I'm moving around out here. Well, on those days, he's got his cello lesson, then his piano lesson, and then he does the university higher math program. So he could probably get in at this time after he finishes his homework, because he's also taking advanced Chinese and history of Indo-European languages. I thought, when do they do anything that's fun?
I know. Yeah. I'm with you there. I'm definitely with you. Kids are really overbooked these days. And, as adults, I think we do that to ourselves, but kids need to be kids.
Yeah. The hardest person to coach I ever had to work with was my own son. Because on the one hand, the urge to push him to be good. On the other hand, it's your kid, and you want him to do whatever. We want him to be happy, and it was difficult. And I try to look at those kids as kids, but always in the back of my head, that clock is running. Right. This kid could be this good. How am I going to get him there with 3 hours a week or 2 hours a week?
Exactly.
So it's hard for me to answer that question. Every club owner twitches when they say, well, and that's another part of it. We have to admit that we're money grubbing small businessmen, and we have to say, okay, when they say, well, we're going to cut to one lesson a week because we're going to do the musical, and you hear the books whimper as everything goes down, and you're hoping the lights don't dim. But you have to be responsible and be the best teacher you can be. So that has to be secondary.
Right.
But it's a hard situation, and I think creating an atmosphere where rather than they have to come to practice, they want to come to practice is better. And if you succeed in doing that, then you're not going to force them to specialize. They're going to choose to do more of this than other things, because they're always going to do other things unless you really push them into it or their parents really push them into it, which are equally bad. But if you make the environment such that they want to be there, then they're going to be there. Best answer I got.
All right, thank you. It sounds like you have pretty much had coaching wrapped up in your fencing from very early. You said that you were, teaching classes and coming up with lesson plans pretty early on in your fencing career.
I think I've been fencing 2 years before I got hired to teach community ed classes.
Okay. And I know that you were thinking about going off to law school and decided instead to take a high school fencing coach position.
Yeah, what an idiot.
Yeah, tell me about your thought process there. And do you have any regrets about choosing fencing over being a lawyer?
I have to ask you, did you go to graduate school right out of undergraduate?
Yes.
Because I finished my undergraduate degree and I looked at going straight on and I said, no.
Okay.
No. I need a break.
A little burned out.
I didn't realize the break was going to last the rest of my life. And I graduated from college in 1980. So for those of you listening who can do math, you know how old I am. Every bit as old as I look. And there were no jobs. And they found me. They sought me out and offered me a full-time position at a high school that was trying to start a whole bunch of after-school programs at a pretty high level. And so I had a full-time position to teach fencing. And I then had to actually figure out how to do it better. And they filled my time with some other things. But that was why they hired me. And it was a pretty good gig. I worked some long hours, but it was a pretty good gig. And I kept going into restaurants, and there were college classmates waiting tables. And I would think, oh, thank God that's not me. Being this, I would be the worst server in history. And the more I got involved with it, then another school offered me a job at 4 times the money, which made it $5.37. And I went there, and then another school, and I went there. And in the meantime, with another coach, I opened the first dedicated facility in the upper Midwest. And we had that more or less going. And I just got more and more involved. I never really thought about it. And perhaps in retrospect, I would have been better off if I had, but I didn't. So I never really looked back. And I put somebody on a world team in the late 80s, and I had no idea what I was doing. I will always argue that I was not making it up as I went along, but I was applying things I had seen other places and broken down and analyzed and said, that's why this works. And it held my interest. It paid the rent. And I never looked back.
Tell me more about that first athlete that you took to a World Cup. I
I have this there was someone I was working with named Barb Turpin, who's one of the great human beings I've ever met. And she had been a fairly accomplished epee fencer. And by that time, I had a pretty good reputation as an epee coach in the upper Midwest in the late 80s, which is, again, not saying a lot. I'd had a fairly decent group of strong and increasingly strong athletes who were finishing in the top 8s and making 4s. And people kept saying, there's no fencing in Minnesota. And I would look around and say, yeah, apparently you're right. I don't know who the hell these people are. But she had moved here to do a postdoc and asked me to give her lessons. And it was enormous fun. And when she retired, she had money left in her, when she retired from fencing. She won national championships. I went with her to world championships in '92 when there was women's epee world championships because it wasn't in the Olympic Games. She retired shortly thereafter from competing, and she gave her training account, all the money in her training account, to an athlete named Sarah Cathy, who had been a pretty good faux fencer. She made you probably don't remember the U.S. Olympic festivals, but there were this great competition that was held every other year. That were the Olympic Games, essentially, for the United States. And they break the country down into 4 regions, and everybody had a team in water polo, in team handball, in fencing. And they were the greatest training camps you've ever seen, because you had basically all of the good fencers in the country, it seemed like, at this thing training for their region. And they were enormous fun, and it was really coveted. You wanted to make those; they were a big deal. Just, if nothing else, all the free stuff, USOC gigs, the free stuff capital of the world. Mm-hmm. She had made some of those as a foil fencer, and she was finishing in the top 8 in under 20 women's foil. She's making a 16 in the occasional 8 in senior women's foil. But she found foil increasingly frustrating and was surrounded by epee fencers, so she decided to try it. Well, the difference was between making the 16s and every now and then an 8, and a lot of 32s, to making an 8, lots of 4s, and every now and then a 2. So Barb Turpin was the woman who gave her the money, gave her training account. And suddenly I could go to World Cups. I had wanted to go. I'd gone to a couple with the women's epee team. Paul Soter was the first national coach in that, and he sent me to some. So I had gone with the team, but I wasn't working for one fencer. I was working for everybody, and it was sink or swim. The first time, in that first World Championships was I was giving Barb a lesson. I'm going to cut back for a second. I was giving Barb a lesson at this first World Championships I've ever been to, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw some guy come in and look at me, pull over a chair and sit down.
Oh, and watch you.
Yeah. And so I'm still going, and now I'm sweating more than I was. And he says something, and this other guy comes in, and pretty soon I collect 3 of them, and I'm trying not to look at them and not to change, where you turn around. I looked over, and I had attracted the 3 Hungarian epee coaches.
Oh, my goodness.
So now I'm really trying to find a delicate and graceful way out of this lesson so I can stop being watched. And that was, the whole experience was like that. Somebody would, who is this clown? And I would move on to the next clownish moment. So when Barb gave Sarah that money, I got to start going, instead of for the team, start going on those trips for Sarah only. And that gave me a lot more time to watch one athlete and focus on what was causing her to win or not win. Watch a lot of other people's lessons, which I still do. If someone is listening and is foolish enough to be listening to me, yes, if I come over and sit down in a chair, I am watching your lesson. I am probably not saying, oh my God, that's awful. I'm saying, wow, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I know in those early days, I was like the world's greatest thief. I would watch these lessons and I would figure out, why are they doing that's really clever. That's a really good way to do things. And I would take that and put it in my pocket. And sometime in the next couple of weeks, it would materialize in some lesson I was giving to see if I could do it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so traveling with Sarah was a really good thing. I'm not just sure it was a good thing for Sarah, but traveling with Sarah was a really good way to learn. Mm-hmm. And every now and then, Paul was still the coach, and he would say, can you do this? And I would then go with the team. But it really helped a lot, being able to work with her.
Yeah.
And she made a number of world teams, went to Pan Am Games. And she was pretty successful. I still see her. She lives in a northern suburb. She calls me every now and then.
That's great. That's great that you keep contact with her.
You wind up keeping contact with most of them.
Yeah. Well, fencing is such an intimate relationship. You really have to know your fencer. And yeah, you can't just put that aside just when they decide to move on to a different career or, start their own club or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, now I want to talk about the Olympics in 2012. Okay. This is a big accomplishment for you as a coach, but also for our country in the world of fencing. What was it like to take the women's epee team to London in 2012?
It was stressful as all hell. The run up to those games was not easy. And I had kept us on the road a lot, combining World Cups with training camps. We had that last year, something that I mentally referred to as the big trip, where we were going to be gone 2 months.
Wow.
Which was admittedly hard on them. And so it had been a lot of work, but that was a team that had been ranked 16th when I came in and was ranked 4th by the time we went to London. That is almost impossible. And so I had made a statement that I had thought that we would medal, and if the seedings fell the way I thought they would, we would probably be third, and if we worked to fence the Italians or fence the Koreans in the medal round, we would be second. And everybody laughed at me. And then we fenced the Koreans in the medal round, and they had been watching us on video just like I had been watching the Russians and the Italians, and changed the way they fenced. And I will always take the blame for this. I simply didn't adapt fast enough. Yeah, none of us were prepared for that. We were prepared for the Italians and the Russians, and we beat them both. We beat the Italians badly. But that was an unpleasant surprise. But you have to remember that there were 3 people on this team that had fenced together on teams as juniors for several years, the Hurley sisters and Susie Scanlon. And as a matter of fact, we had won the World Championships, which was a first for epee for the United States. We'd won the team event, and we were bronze the next year. So they knew how to fence together. And over the course of that quad, we had really hammered out a way of fencing that worked for us. I don't know that it would work for any other team, but it worked for us. And we had learned how to be together. We had learned how to compete together as a team, whether they were getting along or we were all getting along well at the time or not. But they had a way of uniting for those team events. And if you keep people out long enough and all those stresses build up, there are going to be moments where they're not getting along. It's just going to happen. It's human nature. But they would rise to those events. And, they supported each other. That time on the road, which is what I had hoped for, really made them cohesive and made the people who did not make the team, which is a hard process as a coach, by the way, because you really, at least I become pretty attached to those people, and some of them aren't going to make it. And that they're working just as hard as everyone else. And that's going to be pretty crushing. But the continued support from those people who didn't make it really said something good about women's epee. They really continued to support them. And, it was whether they made it or not, it was our team. So it was, I found the pressure horrendous. I tried never to put it onto them. But my jaw was clenched a lot. And I remember waiting to go out on that floor for our first match, for our first team match. And we'd had this running joke that was just another day at the office. And I was standing behind Maya Lawrence, and the curtains opened and all those television cameras swiveled. And the announcer's voice echoed across that big space, Tatsuni, United States of America. And Maya leaned back and said, "Just another day at the office, eh, Coach?"
And she's like, "Breathe, Coach," right?
I don't think any of us were breathing. Oh, my God. And out we went. And it was an astonishing moment. And it was the moment we had been looking towards for all of that time. and every time, and you give a lot of interviews when you're there, you give a lot of interviews, and they would all say the same thing, and I would hear myself say the same thing. We are here for the team. We're waiting for that team event. We will be proud of our individual results, but we are here for the team. And they were. And we crushed the Italians. It would have been harder to look more surprised. And this had happened, I found this happened to me when we won the gold medal at Junior Worlds, which was also against the Italians. I think we had given them a complex. That I was so involved in the match and focused on each and every moment so much that it didn't occur to me till the end how far ahead we were. I was feeling the same level of adrenaline as I would, and keeping it packed very tightly down so I could continue to focus on exactly where we were in the bout. And everyone was following their part of the plan perfectly, and it really was like a machine out there. And only at the end it occurred to me that we had beaten the daylights out of it.
Just focusing on that next touch, not even looking back.
Yeah, and we were always, we never tried to run the game. We never tried to necessarily dash into a huge lead because other emotional things take place then. And it causes your opponent to fence differently. We wanted to defense the way they were fencing, which was dumb. And so, it was always the next thing. Everyone always knew their role. Everyone always knew what we were looking for in the next bout. Sometimes I would say, or the other, and let's start over. Before each and every match, we had a talk. We sat down as a group and we talked about it. We talked about how we were going to shift the lineup or not shift the lineup. We talked about who was going to do what against which opponent. These matches were intricately planned. We didn't do much by accident. We would have gotten killed if we'd done it by accident. Mm-hmm. So we always had a plan. And it went really well. That plan was solid. And there was actually a fencer that was on the Italian team that we knew pretty much 100%, maybe 90%, but we were close to positive that her purpose on that team was to kill Susie because she had always won when they had fenced each other. But what they weren't thinking about was she was winning 15 touch bouts against Susie, but Susie always jumped out to a lead. And then might be attrited. The bouts were always very, very close. So the last 4 weeks of lessons were beating this fencer. So when she walked out on that strip, she crushed her. Mm-hmm. And that was, the Italians had put their hopes on that being a pivotal bout. It was a pivotal bout, all right.
Yeah, it was.
And there's a picture, if you look around online, there's a picture of Susie with her mask off screaming at someone's back. That's the end of that match.
Oh, nice. I think actually I have seen that picture.
She's got her mask ripped off and her arms are back and she's leaning towards this woman's back and the woman is walking away looking very dejected, which she was. Mm. And, it was that kind of stuff. This plan works. Everybody goes out and does their job. Every athlete out there did a perfect job. Mm-hmm. And, up we went. Mm-hmm. And that medal round was difficult. Mm-hmm. And if you watch through it or watch some of the still pictures, I have a pretty poker face the whole time. Mm. And there's several versions of that team match that you can find online. Some are more carefully edited than others. Most of them have edited out an in-depth argument I had with the referee. That was a good place for it. But there's one moment where in my favorite version where you hear the referees, the camera's on the Russian coaches and they're sweating. And the camera's on me and I'm completely blank-faced. And they said, the American coach over there looking quite cool. And when I watched that, I thought, yeah, really? Let me tell you how cool the internal dialogue was.
Well, actually, tell me more about that, because from what I understand, the team was tied with Russia at 30 all, right? And then you needed to go to priority?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's going through your mind at a time like this? Because obviously you don't want to show the athletes that you're worried at all, but your internal dialogue must have been, well, what was it like?
The whole match had a couple of predicates to it. They had a fencer on their team named Violetta Kolobova, and she was regularly death to us, except for Kelly. So Kelly went in, and I put her in position so that in the third round, right, in her third match, she would fence Kolobova, who she soundly beats, and everybody else loses to her. So one of our strategies was, if we had to, fence around Kolobova. We love non-combativity. We're so boring. Or, we're going to pick up one touch here or a double, and then we're going to get the hell away from her, because I felt my job was not to be entertainment, but to win. And I thought there was a possibility that when the Russian coaches looked at how this was going to line up, that Kolobova was going to hit Kelly in that bottom and probably trash her. And then they were going to have to be behind and attack Maya Lawrence. Always a bad plan. That maybe they would take her out. And they did. They blinked and pulled her out. And I remember they came over and did the substitution, and all I could think was, I didn't get you anything. And so that swung things around. We were going to have to hold Luganova, which is not easy. That's a tough team.
Yeah.
It's just a tough team.
Yeah.
But we basically knocked out their most experienced fencer, somebody who'd won world championships, knocked her out. They pulled her. They couldn't have, pardon me, they pulled Kolobova, and everybody else started to stress, and we went ahead, and Maya gave us a lead. And then we put in Courtney, went in the most difficult moment of probably her fencing career, was that match, and the Russian fencer came back. And, I'm not going to say anything negative about Courtney. That would be stupid, because she did a great job. She did a brilliant job. But the Russian fencer came out and was incredible. And she came back.
Yeah.
And she kept driving Courtney back towards our end of the strip. And Courtney, in that match, was doing best going forward. And so, we were all, there's a picture of all of us pointing forward.
That way. Go that way.
But it's like the match in pantomime, these great still pictures. And I remember she turned around and she looked at us in the box, and she looked completely calm, and she went, okay. And she turned around, they race fence, and she went forward. And there were a couple of doubles, which caused us all to freak out. And I remember Kelly saying, I can't watch, tell me what happens.
As she's peeking through her fingers.
Yeah. And, and I just had this feeling, we were all tense as hell, but it was like this feeling that Courtney is now relaxed, and she's going to go forward, and she'll win. And she did. And it's, now historic piece of video, they both missed, and Courtney remaced and hit.
Yes.
But moving into that distance and setting out of that distance prevented her opponent from setting up those touches, and that was all she wrote.
Yeah.
It was. I've never felt so relieved in all my life.
I bet.
Happy, certainly, but relieved. It was like this 200,000-pound gorilla got up off my shoulders. All those people who laughed at me when I said we could do this, everyone said, yeah, women's epee, whatever. And here we were taking home what was probably going to be our only medal.
Yeah.
It was a huge moment.
Yeah.
And Cody Mattern right now has a picture from that up on a advertising seminar. It's the picture I think of Susie jumps, and the four of us are in this huddle in the middle of the strip, and Susie is about 5 feet in the air behind us. And it was a spectacular moment,
Yeah. Yeah. Congratulations, Coach. It was a great moment.
It was astonishing. And I remember we jumped out of the box, and we stood there talking for a minute, and I looked over, and Courtney is standing on the steps. You should go talk to her. And it was one to keep.
Magical.
Yeah.
You've talked about Susie quite a bit in the past few moments. An article that I found said that you knew that she was going to be an Olympian when you met her at age 14. How did you know?
I actually knew her. Susie said she started when she was 9 or 10, which is correct.
Okay.
And what the story actually is she was a kid, and we were doing something. And her mom says that she used to play Olympics. She would set like little events up in the backyard and play that she was at the Olympics. And one day after practice or after some match, she looked at me and said, up at me, because she was still shorter than I am in those days, and said, someday can we go to the Olympics? And I said, sure, we can do that. And on the flight there, she reminded me. I had said that. And I said, well, apparently I told the truth.
Here we are.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's...
She was an awe-inspiringly determined child. There was I don't remember how old she was. I want to say she was 15, maybe 14. in middle school and starting to be pretty successful in cadets. And she had a tournament coming up. The high school gym teacher made her play touch football. And she said, I'd really rather not. I'm afraid of getting hurt. And the teacher essentially bullied her into playing. And sure enough, someone tripped her. She fell down, and someone else stepped on her hand and broke her finger. This finger on her left hand straight laterally across the knuckle.
Oh, no.
Required surgery, required a pin, required months of being in a cast. I have never been so angry in all my born days.
Yeah, I'm
I
sure.
called the club attorney and said, how do you feel about suing the St. Paul School District? He said, I'm good with that.
Yeah.
And she never went to another FIED class, I'd like to add. But during that period, she was on somewhat, and I don't know why, but somewhat restricted because her hand was immobilized and actually in plaster with her finger sticking out. I was told she needed to cut back on her physical activity and so on. And well, about 3 weeks into that, maybe 2 weeks, she showed up at the fencing club. And she said, I'm just going to do full work. I said, are you cleared for this? And she said, oh, yes, of course.
Uh-huh. Fingers crossed behind her back.
A couple of years later, I discovered that she was telling her mother that she was going over to a friend's house to study. The friend was backing her up, and she would come down to the fencing club and do an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours of footwork on her own. Mm-hmm. That kind of drive, first of all, normal people probably don't have it. Yeah. And that might be better. But second of all, you need that kind of drive. Mm-hmm. She had it from a very young age. I didn't tell her to do that. Yeah. Matter of fact, it would have been, I kind of said, should you be doing this? And she said, yes, it's fine. Okay. And she did it she was there every single day.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That is what it takes to get to that level. That level of personal dedication.
Yep.
Totally. Well, let's move to the modern day.
Okay.
You have your own fencing club, and
yes.
You also do work, I believe, with the Youth Enrichment League.
I do. They're a pretty cool organization.
Yeah, tell me more about them.
They run after-school programs. They're like after-school curriculum in a box. School districts hire them to come in, and they have a catalog of activities they offer. And they provide all the equipment. They have actually pretty amazing chess program. They're, I would argue, one of the bigger developmental programs for fencing, at least in the Midwest. We're talking hundreds of kids. We're going to have a tournament in a couple of weeks. Last year, I think there were 165 kids at it.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it's not programs just from the urban area or from the suburbs. It's from the exurbs. It's from outstate Minnesota, where there's nothing like that existed. And I write their curriculum. I teach their teachers. We're trying to move it towards a more formally instructed program, so that these kids are going to come through that, and if they want to, go into a fencing program someplace that's more competitively oriented. And be able to jump in and be a part of it. And those instructors are working hard at it, and I think it's a great organization. And their focus is they're really on learning, and the joy of learning. So I can't say enough good things about their ideals. And slowly and steadily, we're making these guys into fencing teachers. A couple of them are now actually serious fencers and started to compete. And it's interesting and challenging. And I think some of them, when I walked in, thought, "Oh, great, who's this guy?" But it's an interesting group. I'll see them in 2 weeks at that tournament, where I spend a lot of time at those events talking to the kids and talking to their parents. Sometimes I'll stay at a strip and talk to everybody about their bouts as they come off, and it's really fun. So yeah, I'm working with them and I'm enjoying it.
That's really great that kids that might not have otherwise heard about fencing get to be exposed to it through this program.
Yeah, there's a team fencing out of Rochester, Minnesota, out of one of the charter schools there, and it's all girls, and it's all Somali girls.
Wow.
So they're all competing in a hijab. And some of these teams are starting to get into the state high school system now, because we have a lot of high school fencing here. And some of these teams from like Rochester are starting to get into the high school system. So they actually got to fence individual and team at state high school championships. And these programs are starting to really develop. We're talking about working towards opening up an actual fencing club. And the organization is located, really, their offices are in a far western suburb. It's about a 45-minute drive from me. Well, people are not going to drive that far and come to my fencing club. Mm-mm. So we're talking about opening a satellite club out there. Mm-hmm. We'll call it YEL, Twin Cities Fencing, or whatever. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at all those. There are a lot of kids out there, and maybe we build that group into an actual fencing program. Take one of the instructors who's getting serious about it and put him in charge of it, and we start to build fencing in outstate Minnesota. And it's a great goal. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing these programs come up and go from just after school programs to real fencing programs, and that's great.
Yeah, what an exciting project. That's really incredible. All right, well, we are almost at the end of our time together, so I'm going to finish up this interview with a mixture of famous questions from Marcel Proust and James Lipton. I spent a couple of years in France and came to really enjoy this program called Culture Soup. And at the end of every program, whatever celebrity was on this show, he pulled questions from Marcel Proust's famous questionnaire. And then James Lipton from the Inside the Actors Studio picked up on those. And so he has his own version. So I've taken my favorite questions from all three, and I'm going to ask you 10 of them.
This could all go horribly wrong now.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
Okay, what is your favorite word?
Possible.
What is your least favorite word?
Impossible.
What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, that's hard. The goofy person in me says the sound of a wine cork coming out of the bottle. I don't know. Combination of wind and water, probably. Okay. After all, a Minnesotan. We do really go outside and wander around in the woods. And there really are all those lakes. And in the last couple of years, I've taken to snorkeling and working towards diving. And sounds of wind and water.
And what sound or noise do you hate?
Traffic. Urban dweller.
What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
My son feels I should be a history teacher. Because it's on a grand scale telling stories, and he might be right. Mm-hmm.
And what profession would you not like to do?
Restaurant manager.
Oh, yeah, that would. Yeah,
those poor guys, can you imagine?
The ones that are managing your old college friends, right?
Yeah, those guys say, no, thank you. I think that would be a miserable life.
Where would you like to live?
Well, I like it where I am. Lord knows I love the south of France. Mm-hmm. That would work. That would require funding. So let's say the south of France.
Okay. And what do you value most in your friends?
Honesty, affection, loyalty, humor.
Who is your hero?
You know, I got to go back to Jesse Owens. And that was a dinner that changed my life.
And to finish up, what is your motto?
Keep trying.
Well, and you are. You're trying to bring fencing to more and more people, and you're trying to do your best to improve this sport that you've really gotten dedicated to. So thank you so much for all of your coaching, for all of the things that you've brought to U.S. fencing in general, and to your fencers in particular.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate your honesty and your willingness to answer all of these crazy questions.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
A big thank you again to Tony Escueda, who was the creator of the theme music and all music used on this podcast. Also thank you to David Sierra, my great husband, who is always supportive and helps me accomplish what I need to for this podcast. Thirdly, a big thank you to my first sponsor, Cutting Edge Fencing Center, home of the SabreCats, whose generous donation has allowed me to buy some SabreCoachKate podcast swag. All people who interview with me will become the proud owners of a SabreCoachKate podcast patch. And come find me in person at Summer Nationals, where you can find your SabreCoachKate podcast pin. And finally, a big thank you to everyone who has downloaded this podcast, who has listened in any part to this podcast, and all of you who have been so supportive with your comments and likes on Facebook and in other social media. You can check out my blog at sabrecoachkate.wordpress.com for information about this podcast, as well as other blog posts about the dynamic sport of Olympic fencing.